Okay, we have a wonderful slate of speakers here, so grab your coffee or your water. We've talked all day about think tanks, the military-industrial complex, the big ideas behind the blob. What we want to talk about now is how all of this plays into regional policy and the Middle East in particular. So I don't want to spend too much time talking, so I'm going to hand it over to Curt Mills, who is a senior writer at the American Conservative. Previously, he reported for the National Interest, the Washington Examiner, and U.S. News and World Report. So take it away, Curt.
Cool. Thank you so much, everybody, for hanging in there and coming out today. I'm just going to pretty much launch into it. Our panelists are first Doug Macgregor, who's a longtime friend of TAC, decorated U.S. Army combat veteran, would-be national security advisor, author of Margin of Victory, 5 Battles That Changed the Face of Modern Warfare. Mark Perry, also a longtime friend of TAC, author, and Gil Barndollar, who, if you look at your program, I would say, I would tell all our panelists to break a leg, but one of our panelists did break a leg, so I can't make that joke. Gil is a fill-in for Dan. So our topic is the Middle East, which, so obviously not much to talk about. I'll say this. I come at this as a journalist, as does Mark. Gil and Doug have spent some time over there, so they're going to have a different perspective. We're basically 1 year out from the election, and so it's very hard for me to not look forward and everything sort of being into turbo drive into the next election. But let's rewind a little bit into the past election, 2016, which we seem to be borne back ceaselessly into. And I would say, Trump's foreign policy and Trump himself, he launched into the presidency, became president, by attacking the endless wars. And he keeps reiterating that, and we see spasms of this in his foreign policy as president. But we have seen, I think it's fair to say, at least inertia, if not outright intransigence in actually executing his ability to get out of the endless wars. And in some ways, in Iran, for instance, we have probably arguably ratcheted it up some level considerably. So that's the opening. I want to dive into the different theaters, though. And the first thing I think we should address is obviously the last couple weeks, the big news has been the slaying of ISIS Caliph Baghdadi. And I think the open question is, does this matter? Should the U.S. leave? How do we approach that? Or are we just doomed to stay forever? So I think let's just go right to left. Colonel Macgregor. Well, it's right to. Well, if you don't want to go first.
Are you dyslexic, or what's the story? Up too late again last night? As I walked in the building today with my colleague Mark Perry, trudged up the hill, walked into the Hart office building. It suddenly occurred to me that every time I visit this town, because I do live outside of it now, out near Leesburg, I feel like the Pope on a visit to Planned Parenthood. The reason is very simple. The Pope, whatever he says, Planned Parenthood's not going to listen. And what Planned Parenthood wants from him, which is money, he's not going to give them. And that's kind of my problem. And I think that's the problem that besets all of us here today. Because whenever we talk about these issues, whether it's the Middle East or anything else, about commitments overseas operations, and why they should end, we're talking to people, senators and congressmen, who receive enormous quantities of money from various lobbies, foreign and domestic. They're well paid for their votes. And that's why I point out to people that last year we spent $16.2 billion in Syria on military operations. Now, $1 billion was in so-called foreign aid. I don't know where that went. But the rest of it was to support military operations with 2,000 troops on the ground in Syria for reasons that are unclear, quite frankly, and have been unclear for a long time, since The territorial caliphate called ISIS is largely vanished. Meanwhile, in the Defense Authorization Bill, there is a request for $4.7 billion for border security. And everyone is up in arms on the Hill and opposed to spending any money. Not everybody, but the overwhelming majority. Why? No one's paying them. The Chamber of Commerce isn't going to pay them to put up a wall. Who's paying these people? Now, we had these think tank representatives. Chaz Freeman, former ambassador to Saudi Arabia and China, likes to call think tanks advocacy tanks. If he were here today, he'd have been very tough on this last panel. And it was striking to me that the most powerful lobby in this town never came up for discussion. The Israel lobby was never mentioned. Now, truth in advertising, I've worked for years with the Israeli Defense Force. I'm going to go back soon to do some more work. I am a strong supporter, and they didn't have to buy me. I was for free. But if we're not honest and we don't mention this and look at the enormous quantities of money that are involved and why people do the things they do, we're deceiving ourselves. And that was a terrible omission from this last panel. Now, having said that, one last point. In 1620, a Persian army of 50,000 marched into what is today Iraq, laid siege to Baghdad, seized it. When they took control of Baghdad, they threw out all the Sunni Muslims, all the Sunni Muslim administrators, replaced them with Shiite Persians and Shiite Arabs. 20 years later, or almost 20 years later, in 1639, a Turkish sultan leading a Turkish army, an Ottoman army, marched back down to Baghdad, seized Baghdad, removed all the Shiites, all the Persians, Arabs who were Shiites, and replaced them largely with Turks who were Sunni Muslims and some Arabs who were Sunni Muslims. The reason I'm mentioning this is that if you look at the region today, what are you seeing? You're seeing the reemergence of this enormous power struggle over the same areas, once again, that people have been struggling to control for hundreds of years. And it has nothing to do with us. Nothing.
Mark?
That's it?
That's enough.
When I prepared for this presentation today, I thought, I need to say what I really think. And then I thought, are you just being contrarian, or do you really believe what you're about to say? So I'm going to tell you 4 things that I think are going on in the Middle East, and I really believe they're happening. And I think that they are contrarian, and I'm going to get some pushback, but I'm going to say them anyway. I feel like I've spent a lifetime there. I went to the Middle East 42 times over a period of 20 years, and I kind of have a feel for what. Anyway, here's what I think is happening. We're out. We're done. The United States is getting out of the Middle East. We are going to be withdrawing from Syria. I understand. We're not withdrawn from Syria. I understand there's pushback against Trump. I understand he wants to get out. Everyone's going to go, what about the Kurds? Nobody's even heard of the Kurds but we're out. We're getting out of Syria. We're getting out of Iraq. We'll be out of Afghanistan. We're out. And if you don't believe me, believe the current Secretary of Defense, Mark Esper, who said, if you want to talk about the Middle East with somebody, go talk to General McKenzie, who's the head of CENTCOM. I'm concerned with China and Russia. This is what happens when you fail. You change the agenda. No, we're done with the Middle East, Mark. No. Oh, it's old news. We're done. We did fine. We didn't do fine. We failed. That's why we're out. But we're out. That's my first observation. Number 2, the Arab Spring is alive and well. Now, I understand the Arab Spring failed in Egypt when this guy, the man of steel, Abdel Fattah Abdel Sisi, took over and displaced the democratically elected. I understand. But 2 months ago in Egypt, they had very serious rioting throughout the country, and this guy in his palace just barely survived. In Iraq, today, yesterday, last week, and the week before, we've had the tuk-tuk revolution, where people are throwing Molotov cocktails at the Iranian embassy. Iraqis are throwing Molotov cocktails at the Iranian embassy because they're tired of the Iranians having influence in their government. I don't want to say, I told you so, but I told you so. There's such a thing as Arab nationalism in Iraq. When everyone said, oh, Barack Obama turned Iraq over to the Iranians, I said,
Crap.
no, he didn't. And if the Iranians think they're going to have leverage in this government, they're going through a real test right now, and they're going to fail the test. The Arab Spring is alive and well in Iraq, and it's alive and well in Lebanon. We had 1 million people in the streets of Beirut over the last 2 weeks. That's a quarter of the population of the country. And they did something unusual. They lifted up the Lebanese flag. Not the Hezbollah flag, not the Maronite flag, not the Sunni flag, the Lebanese flag. Because they were protesting against enormous corruption and the sectarian form of democracy that they have in Lebanon. The Arab Spring is alive and well, it's just beginning. And here's what we should do to help it out. Not a damn thing. My third observation, Israel doesn't matter. Now I understand Doug is right about the Israeli lobby. They are elbows under the boards, hey, what about Israel? And they're getting shrill about Israel. But Israel doesn't really matter. We, for how long? 20 years, were involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We were going to mediate. We sent Dennis Ross. Here's an idea. Let's ask Dennis Ross about Israeli-Palestinian peace. There's one thing that's true about Washington is nothing succeeds like failure. We had 20 years of mediation on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that went nowhere. And if you really think hard and study that era in our history, you realize that the purpose of the Israeli-Palestinian mediation promoted by the United States was to keep us involved in Israel and for Israel to keep us involved with them. It wasn't to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Did we think that Aaron David Miller really cared about Palestinian rights? It's preposterous. That era is gone, and Israel knows it. Netanyahu doesn't come to Washington to receive his instructions. He goes to Moscow. Over the last 2.5 years, he's been to Moscow 8 times. The lever in the Middle East are the Russians, not the United States. Why? Because of number 2. We're out. Here's my fourth observation. The challenge to us going forward is to make certain that the pivot away from the Middle East isn't more of the same. So that now we have our Army Chief of Staff, General Milley, and our Secretary of Defense, Mr. Esper, saying, here's the real challenge, folks. The Middle East? No. Russia and China. That's the real challenge. And I've been reading articles lately that say we need to restore our American military might. Well, what? We're only spending $733 billion on this. We need to spend more? For what? We have to be careful, I think, in our politics, the American conservative, on the libertarian left, which is where I am, on the libertarian left, that we don't transform competitors into enemies, which we have a habit of doing. That China is an economic competitor of ours is not bad news. Isn't that what we wanted? Weren't we willing to say, listen, stop the Cold War to Russia and China, stop the Cold War and let's compete economically. And when they did, all of a sudden now they're a potential enemy. No, they're not. Let's compete with them economically. Bring it on. But instead, we have a Defense Department, and this is the blob that's going to transform competition into aggression, and it's a mistake. Let's stop this nonsense. I have one final observation, and I've gone on for about 10 minutes too long, but I heard a lot. I listened on Facebook this morning to this conference. I thought it was a really good conference. I heard a lot about the blob. Everyone talks about the blob. And what are we going to do about the blob and the revolving door? And I agree with all of that. And I think it's right to look at it as the blob. But you can penetrate the blob. There are people in the blob who will listen, who are desperate to find out what you think if you know things. Because we're at a point in our history where we realized, whether we say it out loud or not, that American foreign policy has been one unmitigated failure after another over the last 15 years, and people are looking for a way out and a way forward. And if you have that, if you can shape good, precise thinking about how we ought to handle our foreign policy going forward, there are people in this town who will listen and who are listening now. A lot of them are in the Pentagon, not as many as I'd hope there would be. There are some in the State Department. There are even some in the NSC who take a look at something like Yemen and realize what a catastrophe it is and don't have solutions, so maybe you do. What we need to be doing is to be working on those solutions and to shape precise presentations that make sense and reflect the real American values, the primary one of which is non-intervention in the affairs of others. Out of my pocketbook, out of my bedroom, and out of other people's countries.
Dr. Barndollar. I think Doug and Mark have hit the big picture. There's not a heck of a lot to add there. I think that really covers the top-down issues in the Middle East. I agree 100% that we are living with inertia and with a zombie policy and with kind of leftover, a mindset the Middle East that no longer applies, whether for, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has a lot less purchase and a lot less importance than it did, both throughout the region and to us. The oil issues, as everyone knows, due to fracking, due to the changes in that industry and the technological changes, are a lot less salient. The Carter Doctrine need to keep the Russians out of the Persian Gulf, contrary to the little rumblings you hear, and the arguments in that direction still no longer should hold any water. So agree 100% on that score. Let me try to, these gentlemen have handled the big picture so well, let me try to sprint through the details and address the Baghdadi and the Syria piece briefly. There are a couple little interesting things in that, and again, I don't think we have the time if we want to delve into a few more questions here, but some interesting pieces about Idlib and about where he was caught and killed. The ISIS and HTS, Al-Qaeda, the purported animosity, the fact of where he took sanctuary, the kind of the late innings of that civil war in terms of what Assad and his partners are going to do to that jihadist and rebel sanctuary in Idlib, all those kinds of pieces. The extent to which the Turks and the Kurds were involved in the intelligence piece on that, I think is going to unspool, and a lot of it's already starting to creep into the papers, depending on what you believe. But as to his death, fundamentally, I think it's important. I think it's a blow against what's left of ISIS. Someone will replace him. Someone inevitably does. That person will not have his charisma, his kind of purchase on the mental, on the minds of radical and potentially radical Muslims. He was the caliph of the caliphate for the brief existence of that proto-state, and that's a thing. But to me, fundamentally, what it should be looked at, it should be looked at as an excuse to get out. That we should be declaring mission accomplished, right? We're all familiar with that, both good and bad. Unfortunately, I think the bin Laden example is instructive here, and that comparison is being made. But I remember pretty distinctly when bin Laden was killed, I was sitting on my couch in California, and I was in uniform at the time, and just gotten back from a month in the Mojave Desert, and it was a big deal. They were, the cheering in front of the White House gates and all that kind of thing. I went to Afghanistan for the first time 2 months later. We obviously didn't declare mission accomplished. That war turned 18 about a month ago.
We're still there, still playing out the string for reasons that are increasingly incomprehensible. So it doesn't appear that we're going to take what should be an obvious opportunity to declare mission accomplished, to leave and to not try to solve the intractable problems of Syria, let alone the region writ large. If ISIS comes back, and I suspect it or something like it, some very violent, nasty, maybe even nastier Sunni group in Syria, it's probably going to happen in parts of Syria and Iraq for reasons that are entirely outside of America's control. You know, the bottom line is the victor's justice is going on. Assad is committing plenty of atrocities and taking over, you know, consolidating his control. And he obviously doesn't have total control of all the forces on his side. That's part of the equation there. In Iraq, the average counterterrorism trial takes less than 10 minutes. There are a lot of people. It's a great, Ben Taub had a great piece in the New Yorker probably 6-8 months ago looking at that, and I would recommend that to you. There are a lot of innocents and a lot of people that are tangentially connected that are getting swept up and in a lot of cases executed. There's a whole generation of children of ISIS and the wives, you know, the brides of this quick proto-state that are growing up in camps. They're going to be radicalized. That's all horrible. I wouldn't deny that at all. But that is a problem that is either going to be solved by the Iraqis and the Syrians or it's not. It's probably not. But that's not something Americans, and certainly not 1,000 American soldiers, are going to be able to solve. So to me, I mean, I think I had a piece in TAC, gosh, 18, 19 months ago saying, let's get out of Syria. It was like April of last year. Certainly April of this year, when the last stronghold was just destroyed, when Baghdadi was reduced, we should have left post-haste. The fact that we didn't and we prevented a very, you know, unpalatable but necessary rapprochement between the Kurds and Assad, and we were a you know, a roadblock to that, and it's happened eventually. It was going to happen because it was the only real solution to that impasse. We made that situation much worse and made them come on their knees by dint of delaying the pullout. And now we're sitting down there with this kind of farcical, illegal, steal the oil game plan, which I don't know what the hell that is. But you know, it's reached the point of farce, and the Baghdadi thing could have been, and to some extent I guess still could be, an excuse to get out of there and not try to fix the unfixable.
Thank you. Okay, let's focus it a little bit. I want to talk about one country in particular, but of course it's very difficult to divorce any of these countries from any of the other ones. Let's talk Turkey. Just in time for Thanksgiving, right? So this is a country that it's a NATO ally. It's been in the U.S. access for 100 years. And other than perhaps Iran, it's very hard to think of a country in the region that hawks in this city more want to excise from the cool kids table than Turkey. There's potentially some nascent evidence that elements in the Turkish military might have been aware of Baghdadi's presence in Idlib, generally speaking. Is it wise to push out a country like Turkey, or Turkey specifically, from NATO, from coordination? What are we doing here? What's the story? Why you know, Erdogan is coming here next week, the Turkish president. If you believe House Speaker Nancy Pelosi, if you believe Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, there seems to be bipartisan rancor that's grown and swelled to, at the very least, slap Turkey on the wrist for its recent actions, and at worst, thrust it from partnership with Washington at all. Gil, why don't you go first again, or this time?
Okay, maybe I'm wrong here, but I think I'm a little more in between the two of you on Turkey. I would just try to look at that through a realist lens. Look, as you said, Turkey is a NATO ally, is the second biggest force in NATO. You know, you can talk about the coup and about maybe that army is maybe less dependable or has been hollowed out a little bit, but it's the second biggest force in NATO. It's a key hinge point between Europe and the Middle East, obviously geographically where the country sits. It's 80 million odd people. It's a big league economy, despite however much the currency may do roller coasters. So Turkey matters. And to me, look, I'm not a NATO guy. I think we should have walked away from NATO 25 years ago, given them 4 years after the Berlin Wall to get their house in order, and the Europeans can pay for themselves and then some. But, yeah. To me, that's about as straightforward an equation as there is, and I can barely do math. But that being said, if we're keeping the alliance going, if this is a thing, and obviously we're adding new tiny Balkan states all the time, so it is a thing. If that's what we're doing, then Turkey matters. And Turkey remaining in NATO, despite the increasingly authoritarian cast of the government, despite things it does in the region we don't like, to include being kind of a turnstile for ISIS for at least the opening few years until they realized, hey, this thing was getting out of control and they started to control their borders. You can, what they're doing in the Gulf and their part in the Gulf conflict and the GCC, you can point a lot of fingers at everything the Turks are doing, and a lot of that's valid. But let's be adults about it. Like, Turkey fundamentally matters tremendously to the region, has been a long-term U.S. ally, has its own kind of unique strategic issues and interests, and also has, as a result, has some different relationships with people in the region than our Gulf allies. So if we're keeping in NATO, Turkey matters. Secondly, to squander, regardless of how you feel about the Kurds, to put the relationship with Turkey at risk over the Kurds is crazy. I mean, there's no two ways about it. It's essentially the argument I use, the analogy I would use would be kind of the Afghanistan-Pakistan thing. There's a good anecdote. I think it was Joe Biden, but back 5-6 years ago, I think there was a confrontation where the Afghans were trying to really push their luck on something. We're pushing us hard against the Pakistanis, and this is kind of mid-Obama administration. And we're told in no uncertain terms, I think directly by Biden, we're told, you're kidding yourselves. The security, the stability of Pakistan is 100 times more important than anything in Afghanistan. Right? It's not even close. One country, is the second biggest Muslim country in the world, has nuclear weapons, go on and on and on. Afghanistan is a backwater, it's the second or third most corrupt country in the world, et cetera. To me, Turkey and Syria are the same way. We didn't care about Syria effectively for 30 years. It was in the Soviet orbit. The Israelis could beat them with their eyes closed in any kind of war. We didn't care about Syria for 40 years. We don't really need to care about Syria now, but Turkey, on the other hand, matters tremendously. So, again, I'm a little more probably agnostic on Turkey and certainly on NATO, but we need to prioritize what interests matter and what's important in the region. Turkey's important in the region.
Mark?
Well, we should get our forces, our weapons out of Turkey as soon as possible. At this point, there are potential hostages waiting to be taken. I don't like sanctions. Sanctions harm populations. They don't change governments. So I would lift the sanctions against virtually everyone. I think it's ridiculous. The problem that we have with Turkey is not unique to Turkey. It's the problem that we have across the boards. We take the position that you are either with us or against us. The possibility that most of the world on any given day is neutral never occurs to anybody. This was our problem when we went into Iraq. We took the same attitude. Either you're with us or against us. And the British, who mastered this imperial business very, very well, at least until 1914, the first question they would ask when they went anywhere is, who can we work with? Not, are they with us or against us, but who can we work with? Who will cooperate with us? And they would usually pay them off in some fashion and try to isolate the one recalcitrant individual, tribe, or organization and expunge them. We don't do that. We sort of brand everyone as being part of something that we don't like. The other problem is this notion that everyone has to look like us. By that I mean they have to have a democratic government. I mean, I'm one of these people that doesn't believe that the voice of the people is the voice of God. Never have, Hell, everybody in my family was a monarchist, and that goes way back, hundreds of years. We all liked the crown. We had greater trust and confidence in the crown, certainly during the revolution, than we ever did in these crazy revolutionaries with people like Sam Adams. So my point is, we've got to get out of this business of treating everyone as subhuman or inferior or malignant who does not have a system of government that we approve of. This is nonsense. We have to be prepared to do business with people. Erdogan is a tough customer. He's a committed Sunni Islamist. Well, that's his business. He lives in that part of the world. I'm not going to become a Sunni Islamist. I'm not going to join the Muslim Brotherhood. But if that's what he wants to do, then so be it. Are there things that we can cooperate on? Obviously there are. It just is, I don't want to, and you know, you were talking about Russia, and this is very important about Russia right now. People are being misled about Russia. Everyone in Moscow is not thrilled with Putin's position in Syria, haven't been for a very long time. Russia's position in terms of GDP is miserable. They're down to 1% or less growth this year. He's got people telling him, and have been telling him for a long time, you know, this Syria is starting to look like your Afghanistan. So the notion that, you know, this is a great victory for Putin is crazy. He's trying to tell people we need this base in the Mediterranean. And people in Moscow are saying, well, that's interesting because with Mr. Erdogan, he can close the Bosphorus anytime he wants and trap the Russian Navy in the Black Sea. So what do you think you're achieving in the Mediterranean? You're paying a high price for this. And who's fought the most wars against the Turks over the last 500 years? The Russians. Who's number 2 on that list? The Persians or the Iranians? Again, none of this necessarily matters to us. Is there any reason why we can't do business with all of these people? And my answer is no, none. But, you know, I don't have a lobby or a think tank.
You don't want to touch it, Mark?
I did a piece for American Conservative. Yeah, I'll touch it. That's all I'll do. I did a piece for the American Conservative a year and a half ago, and I reported on head of European Command, Curtis Scaparrotti, going to Jim Mattis, the then Secretary of Defense. You might remember he was Secretary of Defense. And saying, let me see if I get this right. We are allying ourselves with a group in Syria that is on our terrorism list over the objections, Turkey, our NATO ally. And Mattis said, well, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And Scaparrotti said, well, explain it to me. And I mean, there was a real fight inside the military over this support for the YPG PKK Kurds while sacrificing the Turks, and that debate hasn't stopped. So maybe I'm naive, but I think when you publish a list of terrorist organizations that you're not going to deal with them, you don't deal with them, or just throw the list out, right? And there they are, PKK. So are we going to stay true to our principles or not? Well, the answer is no, we're not. So, you know, here we are, and it's a stinking mess. It's an absolute mess that we have fought the war on terrorism by using terrorists against terrorists, and it doesn't work. It's not going to work, and that's why my point number 2, we're out. Anyway.
If I can jump in for 1 sec, just to back end on that. That's this idea. You know, you see it in D.C. in a lot of different flavors. But this idea that we can fight a war kind of cost-free, whether it's the technological precision-guided munitions, shock and awe kind of thing we've all been hearing for the better part of 20 years, or whether it's this new idea, this light footprint, we can use proxies, we can use other people to do America's dirty work for it. That comes with consequences. All right, and as Mark alluded to, we're dealing with that now. You know, we chose to fight the war on ISIS, which I would argue it's wildly unconstitutional. We can have that discussion, but I would argue there's a reason to fight that campaign. I don't know what the sentiment in the room is, but regardless of that, we chose to fight that war. 8 Americans were killed, about 11,000 Kurds. Right, we chose them, and I tend to believe the people that said they were the only credible force. You know, we had these ridiculous, something out of a Graham Greene novel, trying to arm these Sunni Islamist groups, and we spent $500 million to put 10 guys in the field or something, and they were routed. So I tend to buy the argument, and there are a few dead-ender think tank folks in town that'll tell you about this Syrian army that could have, the FSA, and secular Syrian nationalists that could have existed. I don't buy that personally, but regardless, we chose the Kurds. We went to war with the Kurds. We armed, supplied, served as their air force, and had guys embedded with them at very low purported cost, to the United States in terms of both men and, in the scheme of things, in terms of money. But now we're dealing with the consequences, which is that we've got a proxy that is butting heads with, as we said, a pretty critical ally in the region. So none of this stuff, even the stuff where you don't see a direct cost in American blood in the papers, none of this stuff is free.
Well, and you know, the criticism against my point of view is salient and valid, which is, you know, the criticism against my point of view, I think, is salient and valid. And I give the critics of my position their due. They say, well, Mark, there's ISIS. What are you going to do? And my answer is, well, don't invade Iraq. Well, too late. But if you don't commit the original sin, you know, you're in a different position than we are. Somebody somewhere back in 2003 should have said, you know, President Bush, we understand where you're coming from, but this is a bad idea. People in the military knew this was a bad idea, and they didn't say a word.
We're going to do one more question, and then we're going to open for questions. So real quickly, I want to move into the political. Unfortunately, maybe fortunately, there's unanimity on this panel, I think, about the policy itself that the administration has recently undertaken in the Middle East, which is pull out in Syria and pull out more broadly. But I want to ask a question about efficacy and whether or not the Trump administration, the president, however haphazard and feckless the maneuvers recently have been, are they worth defending? So since Christmas last year, the president has announced multiple pullouts in Syria and has done them in some respect, has announced the intention to want to leave Afghanistan and shuttered negotiations with the Taliban suddenly, even though he wanted to bring them to Camp David. So he's like on both ends of the spectrum. Obviously, the president wants to end these endless wars, but he's staffed an administration with pretty conventional conservative hawks. Some might even argue more hawkish elements than a standard Republican would have had. On the other hand, I think he's moved the Overton window on foreign policy in America, and certainly foreign policy on the right, more than any figure in my lifetime. Is this project, is it worth supporting the administration? Is this, at least on this prerogative, or should basically people who want to reform foreign policy wash their hands of it? Real quickly, starting with Colonel Macgregor, who knows a little bit about this.
Well, I don't think that those of us who are really interested in disengaging from these overseas commitments have much choice. If you watched the last Democratic debate, the one person who was unambiguously in favor of disengaging was Tulsi, the Congressman Tulsi, and she was practically excluded from the discussion. Now, Elizabeth Warren subsequently began to backpedal somewhat, but still in all, there's no evidence that the left, if it gained power, would do anything that makes sense. So in that sense, I don't think we have much choice. Now, there's something else that's very good about President Trump that should not go unmentioned. He was ambushed successfully by people inside his administration, including those at the top of the military, in the Persian Gulf. They set him up for a war. We were very close to pulling the trigger. And he correctly surmised this was a potential disaster that could be avoided. And he stopped it. So he deserves credit for that. One other thing I would add to this that everybody in this room needs to understand that Americans don't get at all these days. War to most Americans is something that happens on television in someone else's country. That's because we have been clubbing baby seals. We have not been fighting robust enemies with armies, air forces, air defenses. Not at all. I mean, the notion that we could spend $6 trillion brutalizing people whose most effective weapon is a command-detonated mine is incomprehensible. If nothing else springs off the page, you should see that as a tremendous scam that has made all sorts of people very, very wealthy who don't deserve it, and has expanded this enormous military bureaucracy with its huge overhead that is of questionable value, even now, certainly no value in a war. So that needs to be kept in mind. And we need to understand that we've got to be very careful now, because as we press forward, and I still see no evidence that anybody at the top of the Pentagon is prepared to step back right now. Everyone is still willing to go forward. We're running out of weaklings to fight. We're going to end up challenging someone somewhere that we don't expect who actually has armed forces and can fight. And I think that Donald Trump recognized that that was the case in Turkey, which is another reason he decided to leave. But again, he doesn't have much experience in these areas. He's not good on following through on his instincts, and he's surrounded by people that tell him to do something else.
Mark, real quickly.
Half the people that walk into military recruiting stations can't join the military because they're either overweight, illiterate, have a record of being in prison, or whatever. Oh, former drug use. Half. We can't find the airmen, soldiers, and sailors to man our military. That's the biggest crisis this military faces. And at some point, the President of the United States somewhere, some neocon President of the United States is going to say, we need to do this and that and the other thing, and the Air Force Chief of Staff says, you're right, Mr. President, we can't do it.
Yeah, but all the people you just described that were rejected are working here in Washington, D.C., State Department, and elsewhere.
I think that the hardest thing in Washington changes a bad policy. Anybody can change a good policy and make it worse. It happens every day. But the changing a bad policy only happens when people have to face the reality that what they're doing just doesn't work. And we're almost at that point where the $700 billion bloated defense budget is untenable, and it ought to be a $700 billion education budget. And the closer we move to that reality, we are moving closer to it, the faster you're going to see this foreign policy change.
Captain Barndollar.
Well, I would, to finish up with Mark's point there, I would hope that we would have a point where somebody with stars on their shoulders would tell the administration, hey, this is unachievable. Unfortunately, the evidence of the last 15, 20 years is that nobody says that. If they do, it's behind very closed doors, doesn't come out very often, because at the end of the day, there's literally one general, Greg Newbold is the only guy that I know of. I'm missing one, but he's the only one I can think of. You've written books on this. As far as I can tell, he is literally the only guy who ever had a legitimate moment of conscience and said, and put his stars on the table and resigned, and had the moral courage to protest, not publicly enough in a lot of ways. It was a blip on the radar in the run-up to the Iraq War, and then he was gone, and maybe to his credit, has not made himself a public figure since then. That was it. Out of a general officer corps, we've got dozens of guys, a couple dozen with 4 stars, and you get into 3, 2, and down the line. I mean, we have the overhead staffing that we had, bigger than we had for a 12 million man force in World War II, right? So the idea that somebody's going to front up and say that, hey, this is a fantasy. We didn't do it when we tried to pacify, damn near 30 million people in Afghanistan, and one of the most backward countries in the world with 100,000 armed Americans, primarily 19 and 20-year-olds. That was always a fantasy. So the idea that there's going to be finally some institutional resistance and some acceptance of reality, I wish I had your optimism. Quickly and broadly on this issue, fundamentally, I don't think there's a lot of there with the Trump administration's foreign policy period, and especially with the Middle East. The president certainly campaigned on and had policies, and actually I wouldn't even say policies, I would say had some inchoate impulses that I think are really healthy, and that I think the majority of the American people are starting to get, and said a lot of things that were great. Again, that sort of seminal moment at the South Carolina debate against Jeb Bush was a watershed in a lot of ways, but you look at what's happened since. There hasn't been a lot of substance to go with that. Yes, okay, we've pulled out from one part of Syria to another part of Syria. We've sent more troops to Saudi Arabia. We're just as entrenched, even more tightly with the Saudis and with the Israelis and some of these purported partners in the region that in a lot of ways seem to be calling the shots and driving our policies. So I just don't think there's a lot of substance to go with the rhetoric that everybody gets all excited about. And we're now, on the tail end of this administration, I would think people are starting to see past the cheap talk to the reality on this stuff. And when it comes to, if you want to hang your hat on Trump as a non-interventionist president, you're going to hang it on no war with Iran, right? And that's great. At the end of the day, it was the smart and potentially salvation was climbing down from a potential war with Iran over a drone shoot down or over the attacks in the Gulf and being sensible about that. But that was a crisis entirely created by this administration. So, and the same thing happened in Korea to a slightly different degree. So you create a problem and then you walk away from it, and that problem is still bubbling. Nothing's solved there. And the military imbalance in the Gulf, which doesn't get redressed unless we are willing to fight for the Gulf monarchies, which we don't seem to want to do, that's still lingering. So we're creating problems and then semi-solving them or not taking them to the worst possible extreme. That's not a lot to be excited about.
Do we have any questions from the audience? Okay, please come up to the mic.
Yeah, you mentioned Tulsi Gabbard as the only Democratic candidate who's come out in favor of restraint. One other candidate who she also endorsed in 2016 is Bernie Sanders, and he has a record of restraint with regards to the Iraq War, the Gulf War. He's been a leader on the War Powers Resolution regarding Yemen. So I was just wondering if I could get some of your thoughts about Bernie Sanders' record on foreign policy, and whether or not you think he's someone that could do meaningful work with a restraint coalition.
Yeah, so let's be careful. Obviously, not going to endorse any candidates, but like, are there candidates that in the race that you think would meaningfully move the paradigm, shift the paradigm, and are there candidates that are particularly concerning? Start and focus, if you can, for the questioner on Senator Sanders. Doug?
Well, I think Senator Sanders is, unfortunately, like most of his peers, he supported the F-35 because he wants F-35 sitting on air bases in the Air National Guard in Vermont. F-35, I think, is a disaster, should never have been started to begin with. So I don't know that we can bet heavily on the certainty that if Sanders were ever elected to anything at that level as president, that he would carry through on those things.
Mark?
I think a guy like Bernie Sanders could be very helpful in pulling other candidates to his point of view.
What if Sanders is the candidate?
Yeah, I don't have any problem with Bernie Sanders as the candidate. I've noticed recently that Elizabeth Warren has started to change her tune on Israel a little bit, and I thought, boy, it must be a little bit more appetizing now. They've calculated that they're not going to lose that much money or that many votes. So, I mean, I hate to be a cynic, but, it is the Democratic Party, the party of, defending the FBI and the CIA, and anyway.
Yeah, I think Sanders, agree with the question. I think Sanders is great on a lot of this stuff. I think he's not, to my mind, he's not great on China, and I think is a little bit naive about some of that stuff. But on the Middle East, I think he's pretty good, and would be a lot of, if he did what he wants to do, and that's always the question, right? And we've seen both Obama and Trump had, I think, a lot of the right impulses and got very quickly rolled by the establishment and by to some extent by the military. But Sanders would be good. Warren, you kind of know what to. I don't think she cares about foreign policy, in any meaningful way.
That's a problem. That's a problem.
It's a problem, right? That's a problem because.
So vote for her.
No. Yes and no. I would tend to agree with you. Like, this is a country that can almost do without a foreign policy in this day and age in a lot of ways, or almost, contrary to everything you hear. That's one of the things nobody wants to admit. But the problem is, if she doesn't have a foreign policy, doesn't care tremendously about it, she's going to naturally get co-opted by all the other weight that is not on this side of the table. I think that's the reality. I think if you're ignoring that, you're silly.
Let's move along.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
Next question.
Marta Rebetti from Wilson Center. What is the role of ethics in the conservative foreign policy? Like the question of Curt, you could argue we should not have been in the Middle East and in Syria. The fact is we were, and the Kurds helped our cause, a fight against the Islamic State. So, abandoning them, doesn't that look bad? So in other words, what's the role of ethics?
Mark, touch this one.
And if I could please ask the gentleman to speak more into the, when you speak more into microphone, it's very difficult to hear you. Thank you.
Well, first of all, this business of abandoning the Kurds bothers me. The Kurds we're talking about in northeast Syria are communists. They have a long history of close cooperation with the Soviet Union, long-standing relationship with Russia. They saw value in cooperating with us in the hopes that they could expand the territory that they controlled that could become a platform for attack against Turkey, and ultimately part of a greater Kurdistan. I don't see us abandoning them. I think it was a tactical relationship of convenience. I think they understood that, and I know the people who were in the field with them because I knew them when I was on active duty, and they told me clearly, don't believe this nonsense. They always knew that this was tactical, not strategic. They always knew this was for a very specific purpose. So I don't like the word abandon. I think that's a very misleading characterization.
Does anybody else feel strongly about it, or should we move?
I agree.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Next.
Hi, Jeff Groom. I have kind of a question for Mark Perry about the Arab Spring. Is there any way to like easily characterize the nature of these protests that they've been going on for a while, but now they're coming back? Are they secular and nationalist, and they're trying to, they're pushing back against, Islam, or is there a component of, Sunni versus Shia in it, or not?
Well, I think that we've been so kind of consumed with, Trump and impeachment and all this stuff that we've kind of ignored this very big story going on around the globe. I mean, it's not just the Arab world. This is Hong Kong, Ecuador, Chile. I mean, it's really kind of extraordinary, and it's in each of these locations, these young people have been very well organized, and the Arab Spring component of it is the same. It's anti-corruption, anti-sectarianism, very kind of millennial, and very nationalistic in many ways. It's and very democratic, and really inspiring, I think. So there was a New York Times video of the Hong Kong protests a couple weeks ago, and these young people are really inspiring, doing some really good political work. And I think that's happening in Lebanon, in Iraq, and I hope that you could just see this coming in the weeks ahead. If it were to happen in Riyadh, we'd say, well, this is Iranian influence. We need to stand behind MBS. I hope we don't do that kind of stupidity, and that we say, to the Chinese government, you need to act with restraint in Hong Kong and meet the demands of these protesters, at least begin to talk to them and accommodate them. And we ought to say that in Chile and Ecuador and Lebanon, instead of, pointing fingers and thinking about what we think our interests are. This is a good thing, and it's going to continue. And the other thing I didn't say during my talk, but Assad really won in Syria. But I don't think that we've heard the last of what's going to happen in Syria. These movements are really rooted, these young people's movements, anti-corruption movements, are really rooted in the Middle East. They're very strong. I wouldn't want to place any bets on the long-term survival of the Assad regime or the Sisi regime in Egypt. These movements have real depth to them, and I think real power.
Thank you.
Next question.
How you doing? At this meeting last year, some of you remember that.
Please introduce yourself.
My name's Kevin. I'm just a subscriber to the American Conservative. I'm not anybody.
No.
But Rand Paul was at the meeting last year. He gave a speech. I think the Khashoggi thing has just happened, and he was talking about the stuff in Yemen, about how we should be applying so much more pressure to Saudi Arabia. And I've always been kicking myself for not asking him about the petrodollar arrangement and how much pressure we can realistically apply to Saudi Arabia without them accepting yuan for oil shipments and unwinding the dollar. In the time since then, it's really started to alarm me how much leverage it looks like, how much power it looks like Saudi Arabia has over our military and our government at large. I mean, Tulsi Gabbard came up before. Her current initiative is about enabling families of the victims of September 11th to actually sue Saudi Arabia, which our government is standing in the way of. I just checked my phone. We are deploying 1,200 troops to Saudi Arabia to protect the oil fields because of, the Houthis with an RC helicopter with an M80 on it or whatever, But 1,200 troops got their marching orders over that, and they're not there yet. Like, that's ongoing. It seems to me that we will not be leaving the Middle East until Saudi Arabia gives us permission to. So your thoughts on that?
And I would add, just in the news today, obviously these countries are interested in influencing private enterprise as well. 3 people are being either indicted or convicted for spying, Twitter employees for spying for the kingdom. Gil, you want to touch on the gentleman's question?
Yeah, sure. I would say a couple things. Like, the previous panel covered a lot of this ground, and to me, the biggest danger to American national security is corruption. Whether you want to talk about straight up, access capitalism, corruption, it's more glaring in a lot of ways on China than it is on the Middle East. But and as Ben Friedman and some of the folks said, that a lot of the time that's not a direct pay to play. It's a much more intricate and maybe nefarious kind of long-standing arrangement. But I think, going back to something Mark said much earlier, the biggest thing in relation to the Saudis, I think, is this kind of inertia and this zombie policy and this outdated idea that that the stability of the Gulf monarchies is the be-all, end-all. Now, the thing I will caveat that with is this.
You don't think there's a new Middle East?
The new Middle East, yeah, that's a whole nother discussion. I don't buy that kind of talk, and I think that talk is bought with a lot of foreign money sometimes. But one big thing I will say in defense of the existing arrangements, in defense of our kind of attachment to the Gulf monarchies, is this: that strategic imbalance in the region, regardless of all the money and that, the absurd Saudi defense budget and the amount of procurement they buy and the weapons they buy, the Saudis, the Emiratis, other countries to a lesser degree, Yemen showed what everybody that spent any time, in the region, in or out of uniform, looking at it, really understands, is that the Saudi army can't fight their way out of a paper bag. That's a problem because, you look across the strait, you look at Iran. Iran is, I think we can. I happen to be in favor for all of its faults with the JCPOA, and walking away from that with no plan was bad. And I think Iran is more, to me, comparing Iran to kind of a sclerotic late Soviet Union thing is more apt, despite the flaws of that analogy, than looking at this firebrand revolutionary power. But the bottom line is, despite all the money the Saudis spend, the Saudis can't fight their way out of a paper bag. The Emiratis, I would take I just got back from the Gulf last week, I would take some of the little Sparta talk with a grain of salt, but the Emiratis are far more competent enough to realize they can't win in Yemen. But there's 1.1, give or take 1.2 million Emiratis, 7 million expats. They're not going to fight a war with 80 million Iranians, regardless of what kind of crazy piece you might read in a magazine here and there. So that imbalance is a real thing, and I think we should quit the region, but there's a smart and a dumb way to do that. And if we're going to leave, to prevent the phrase you may sometimes hear, to prevent the Finlandization of the Gulf monarchies, somebody needs to balance there, whether it's us, whether it's the Chinese, whether it's the Russians, or we need to accept that there's going to be Iranian dominance in the Gulf. That may not be the end of the world. Everybody's got to sell oil. It's got to go out that straight. But we should accept what that's going to look like, absent American military power.
Don't knock crazy pieces in magazines, Gil. We got to. Last question.
Medea Benjamin with Code Pink. We're talking about getting out of the Middle East. We have to talk about all the military bases we have all over the Middle East. And ironically, I think that's one of the reasons the U.S. has not gone in militarily in Iran, because they know the Iranians are ready to attack so many of those bases. How can we realistically build some kind of coalition that would start to close some of these over 800 military bases we have around the world? Who can you see that is there a constituency for those bases, and what could we do in the coming years to build a constituency to close them?
Should we close these bases, and if so, how all around?
Well, first of all, the overseas bases are part of the larger military problem that you have. Your overseas contingency operations fund, $80, $90, $100 billion, in addition to the $735 billion defense budget, is bound up with this problem. Everything revolves around the threat picture. We don't have a national military strategy. We have a national spending strategy. That's what it's all about. Mark pointed out that, well, the Middle East isn't going to provide us with the rationale for excessive spending as it once did. Remember the talk about Saddam Hussein? And he was on the verge of weapons of mass destruction, and he had armies and hundreds of thousands of men, and this was going to be a terrible war back in 1990. Everybody who knew anything about the Middle East, and unfortunately none of those wore army uniforms at the time, they all knew this was ridiculous. This was another Arab army. It was not bad. It was pretty good, but the best it could do was defend in place. It couldn't attack anybody. And we punched through it very, very quickly. We did an awful lot of damage, unfortunately, unnecessarily. But the point is, when you look at the Arabs in the region, over the last 1,000 years, what have the Arabs dominated or controlled in the Middle East? Nothing. Nothing. Everything has been Turkish, Persian, or European dominance. If we pull out, first of all, Saudi Arabia is very fragile right now. People don't realize that regime is not strong. Just a few months ago, Mark and I were, in fact, talking about the prospects of seeing the thing collapse in front of us because of the Yemen war, the Houthis.
That'd be good.
Good Lord. So there's no You cannot sustain the unsustainable. We don't live there. Everybody loses sight of that. Our presence deforms the natural forces in the region. So if we leave, the natural forces will return. And the Russians understand that as well, which is why they keep telling Putin, you better rethink this thing in Syria. How much of the Russian defense budget are you prepared to expend to contain the Turkish threat?
Mark.
I think for activists, this is a bank shot. By that I mean, you're not going to sit down with four-star generals and convince them that the defense budget is too big and needs to be cut. They're never going to agree to that, ever. But you can sit down with generals, four-star generals and admirals, and tell them that the lines lining up at the recruiting stations are getting shorter and fatter, and that this is a real problem they need to pay attention to. And they'll say, yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe, well, when I wrote this article for American Conservative, I called some of the generals who were part of this thing called, I hope I don't get the name wrong, Project Renewal. These are 70 guys, 2, 3, 4-star admirals and generals, retired, who are pushing an initiative to fund PK through 12, and not the military, because they're worried. And I thought, well, now this is creative. So you could, maybe you can pass a National Defense Education Act, like the National Defense Highway Program, right? Where you take part of the defense budget and you say it's part of the defense budget, but what you do is you reprogram it to education, because that really helps our national defense. And that's what I mean by a bank shot. If we sit around and bang the table about how big the defense budget is, everybody knows that. And nobody's going to agree to cut it. So how are you going to, you have to recruit the military on this. There are plenty of generals out there, no, well, not plenty, but there are enough generals out there who think that $700 billion is too much and that maybe a portion ought to go to national education programs, because that's going to help them the best. And that's the hope for the future, I think.
Gil.
One real quick point. The allowance for the use of military force, one of the reasons that's so strongly supported in the Department of Defense is it allows for essentially limitless general officer and admiral positions. Right now we have 1.2 million Americans in uniform. We have 42 4-stars. When we had 12.2 million Americans in uniform in 1944 in January, we had only 7 4-stars. So what you've got is a banana republic force, a huge overhead, not much that can deploy and fight. And everyone's playing with technologies that are interesting that can be used to dominate weak opponents. And it's about keeping the money coming. How do you keep the money coming? You talk about the threats overseas and the justification for forward presence. Pull back the forward presence, bring the troops home, and then suddenly that money begins to dry up. So I think bringing them home is very important.
Gil.
And I would just say real briefly to your point about the installations themselves and this kind of archipelago of American bases we have, that sort of infrastructure of empire is going to start retracting because we're not going to be able to pay for it. I mean, that's the manpower thing is a huge piece of that, and the manpower and the cost thing are twinned. But the next decade is going to get really interesting, even just within the service budget, leaving aside all the massive looming fiscal problems this country has down to the municipal and state levels. You look at the defense budget, the Navy already calls it openly the terrible 20s, because they got to recapitalize the ballistic missile submarines. They've got all kinds of other aging warships. Forget growing the Navy. I mean, you'd be lucky not to shrink substantially. Army and the Air Force have their own problems as well. So a lot of these kind of optional and to the clubbing SEALs point, a lot of these kind of optional things we've gotten away with because we've been living in a strategic holiday since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Some of that is going to go away maybe sooner than we think, including a lot of these optional bases overseas, maybe even some of the bigger tactical infrastructure and strategic infrastructure we have, because we're going to have to make hard choices when it comes to money. So that's where some of that is going to retract. I don't know how much of it.
Okay. I'd like to thank our panelists. I'd like to thank our audience. I I am de facto our closing speaker, and I'd just like to thank everybody for coming here and attending today's event. Please consider coming to the American Conservatives' other events, our gala in May, and I'll see you next decade or next year when we have this event, in which promises to be a quiet 12 months, I'm sure. So, see everybody.